It was, if I do say so myself, a masterpiece. A monument to Finch kind. I stood on my perfectly manicured lawn, hands on my hips, a retired mechanical engineer admiring his first purely artistic creation. I called it the Avian Grand. Let's be clear. When you hear the word birdhouse, you probably picture a little wooden box with a hole in it, maybe a perch. Cute, quaint, pathetic. The Avian Grand was to a normal birdhouse what a 7-course tasting menu is to a gas station hot dog. It was a 3-story, tiki-themed bird condominium, lovingly crafted from weather-treated cedar. The ground floor was the communal dining area, complete with a miniature seed trough I'd engineered for optimal flow. The second and third floors featured 4 private nesting suites each, complete with individual balconies made from interwoven twigs. The roof was thatched palm, and a decorative water feature, fashioned from a coconut shell and a tiny solar-powered pump, trickled serenely down a series of polished riverstones. I'd even spent an entire afternoon with a wood-burning tool to carve a tiny sign that hung over the main entrance. Live, laugh, chirp. For the first time in the 6 months since I'd retired from a 40-year career of designing industrial gearboxes, I felt a sense of purpose. My brain, once occupied with torque ratios and stress tolerances, had been slowly turning to mush-watching daytime television. My wife, Sarah, said I needed a hobby. She suggested golf. I suggested I'd rather laminate my own hand. This, though? This was engineering. It was creation. It was giving back to nature, one ridiculously over-engineered bird dwelling at a time. A small brown sparrow landed on the railing of the top-floor balcony. He chirped. "What do you think, buddy?" I asked, pointing. "Is the feng shui right? I was worried the water feature might be a little loud for the west-facing suites, but the sound is supposed to be soothing." The sparrow chirped again and flew off, probably to tell his friends. "Are you asking the birds for architectural feedback again, Leo?" Sarah's voice came from the porch. She was holding 2 glasses of iced tea, a small, amused smile playing on her lips. She'd seen my slow descent into retirement madness and had, to her credit, mostly just let it happen. "I'm conducting a post-occupancy evaluation," I said matter-of-factly. "It's standard practice. Just want to make sure the tenants are happy." "Are you planning to charge them rent?" she asked, handing me a glass. The condensation felt good in the warm afternoon air. "Only if they start throwing loud parties. I'm running a respectable establishment here." We stood there for a minute, just watching it. Even Sarah had to admit it was impressive. It was, however, also quite large. Maybe 4 feet tall, and a good 3 feet wide. Substantial. A statement piece. A piece that, as it turned out, was making a statement I hadn't intended. That's when I saw it. Correct. Into the mailbox, peeking out from behind a pizza coupon and a water bill, was a crisp beige envelope. It was the color of surrender, the color of joyless conformity. It was the official color of the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association. My stomach tightened. Nothing good ever came in a beige HOA envelope. I walked over, a sense of foreboding settling over me. I pulled it out. My name and address were printed in a soulless Times New Roman font. The return address simply said, Architectural Review Committee. It sounded like a tribunal from a dystopian novel. I tore it open. The paper was thick, expensive. They certainly weren't skimping on the stationery for their passive-aggressive decrees. I read the first line aloud. "Dear Mr. Maxwell, it has come to the attention of the committee." I looked at Sarah. "It always starts like that. It has come to our attention, like a secret police force has been monitoring my bird-related activities. The letter was a masterpiece of the form, a symphony of petty tyranny penned by its composer and conductor, Brenda Mills, HOA president. It cited a dozen different bylaws. Bylaw 17, Section C, Subsection 4. Size limitations for non-permanent auxiliary structures. Apparently, the unapproved auxiliary structure exceeded the maximum allowable volume of 4 cubic feet. My tiki condo was, by my own calculations, closer to 36. It also violated Bylaw 22, Section A, on approved color palettes. The vibrant oranges and yellows of my tropical theme were, it seemed, not on the approved list of beige, slightly darker beige, taupe, greige, or moody mushroom. Finally, and this was the part that really got me, it constituted a visual nuisance. A visual nuisance? I thought, my blood starting to simmer. Brenda, your front yard contains a concrete goose that you dress in seasonal outfits. Last week it was wearing a rain slicker and holding a tiny umbrella. Don't you dare talk to me about taste. The letter concluded by informing me that I had 14 days to remedy the violation. Tear down my beautiful creation or face daily fines. 14 days, I scoffed, waving the letter. It took me longer than that just to source the miniature palm fronds. Sarah sighed. Leo, it is a little big. It's majestic. It's for the birds. They're homeless, Sarah. I think they were doing okay with trees, she said dryly, but I could see the spark of defiance in her eye. She hated Brenda's reign of terror as much as I did. I couldn't let it stand. Letter in hand, I marched across the street. Brenda's lawn was immaculate, the blades of grass so uniform they looked like they'd been installed by a military barber. Her concrete goose was, I noted with disgust, now wearing a little sun visor. I rang the bell. The door opened, and there she was. Brenda, clad in a beige pantsuit, holding a clipboard. I swear she slept with that thing. It was her Excalibur. Leo, she said, her voice dripping with false pleasantry. I was wondering when you'd be stopping by. Brenda, what is this? I asked, holding up the letter. It's a birdhouse. It's an unapproved structure, Leo, she corrected, tapping her pen on the clipboard. The bylaws are very clear. Any detached structure cannot exceed 4 cubic feet. It's for the birds, Brenda. For the birds. They're not going to be applying for a mortgage or trying to sell it. It's a house for tiny flying animals. Be that as it may, she said, unmoved. It detracts from the architectural harmony of the community. We have standards to maintain. Imagine if everyone just started building whatever they wanted in their yards. It would be chaos. Architectural harmony. I almost laughed. Your house is a beige box. My house is a beige box. Every house on this street is a beige box. The only thing breaking up the beige monotony is my glorious birdhouse. The matter is not up for debate, she said, her smile tightening. 14 days, Leo. Have a lovely afternoon. And she closed the door in my face. I stood there on her perfectly edged welcome mat, fuming. Defeated. I walked back to my own porch and sank into a chair, the beige letter crinkled in my fist. I stared at my beautiful, unapproved bird condo. Then I stared at my boring, very much approved house. The phrase echoed in my head. Architectural harmony. Brenda wanted the things in my yard to be in harmony with my house. She wanted everything to match, to conform. A slow, mischievous, and frankly unhinged idea began to form in the quiet, unused spaces of my engineering brain. An idea so petty, so precise, so perfectly compliant in its maliciousness that it just might work. I looked at my beige box of a house. I looked at the letter. A grin spread across my face. "Fine, Brenda," I muttered to the empty porch, a new sense of purpose surging through me. "You want my birdhouse to match my house? You got it. To scale." My garage, once a sad purgatory for lawn equipment and forgotten Christmas decorations, was immediately transformed. It became my engineering and retaliation hub. The dusty workbench was cleared, drafting lamps were installed, and my old T-square, which hadn't seen action since my college days, was given a place of honor. The first order of business was to acquire the weapon of my choice, the original blueprints for my own house. I'd kept them, of course. Engineers don't throw away blueprints. You never know when you might need to reference the precise load-bearing capacity of your living room floor. I unrolled the massive sheets of paper across the workbench, the crisp crackle echoing in the quiet garage like the starting pistol for a very, very stupid race. There it was. Model 3B, the Sycamore, the pride of Maple Creek Estates. A 2,400 square foot, 2-story colonial with 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, and all the architectural personality of a cardboard box. But it was an HOA-approved cardboard box, and that was all that mattered. "Okay," I muttered to myself, pulling out a calculator. "Let's see. The house has a footprint of 48 by 30 feet. If we go with a 1/12 scale, that makes the birdhouse 4 feet by 2.5 feet. Perfectly reasonable." The next 3 days were a blur of meticulous calculation and maniacal drafting. I wasn't just building a box. I was recreating my home in miniature. I designed a tiny foundation. I calculated the pitch of the roof to the exact degree. I drew up plans for miniature double-hung windows and a tiny 6-panel front door. I even designed a scaled-down, non-functional HVAC unit to sit on the side of the house, just like the real one. Every detail had to be perfect. This wasn't just about spite. It was about craftsmanship. Malicious, beautiful craftsmanship. Sarah walked in on the second night to find me hunched over a drawing, muttering about miniature joist hangers. The floor was littered with crumpled paper and pencil shavings. "Leo, what on earth are you doing?" she asked, navigating the mess. "Just designing a decorative lawn feature," I said, not looking up. "I'm making sure it's fully compliant with all local ordinances, of course." She peered over my shoulder at the blueprint I was working on. It was a cross-section of the garage. "Does that say, tiny 2-car garage with functional roll-up doors?" she read aloud. "The wrens need somewhere to park their twigs," I replied, deadpan. "Can't have them cluttering up the tiny driveway. Brenda would have a fit." She just shook her head, a mixture of exasperation and deep, deep amusement in her eyes. "You're insane. You know that?" "I'm an engineer, Sarah. It's the same thing." By the end of the week, I had a complete set of blueprints that would have made my old firm proud. But I quickly ran into a problem. I could design it, but building a weatherproof, structurally sound miniature house that could withstand the elements and Brenda's withering gaze was more than a one-man job. I needed professionals. Professionals who wouldn't have me committed. My first few calls were, to put it mildly, discouraging. "Hello, Johnson Construction?" "Yes, I have a custom residential project." "Well, it's a single-family dwelling." "Scale? Oh, it's 1/12 scale." "Hello? Hello?" Click. The next guy actually laughed for a solid 30 seconds before hanging up. A third quoted me a price that suggested the tiny house would be constructed from solid gold and the tears of angels. I was starting to lose hope when I saw an ad in the back of the local classifieds paper, stuck between a psychic hotline and a sale on used lawnmowers. Frank's Home Repair, no job too weird, free estimates. That sounded promising. The next day, a slightly battered Ford F-150 pulled up. Two men got out. The first, Frank, was a burly man in his late 50s with a magnificent gray mustache and a permanent look of weary skepticism. He looked like he'd seen it all and been disappointed by most of it. The second was a lanky kid in his early 20s wearing a backwards baseball cap and ripped jeans. "You the guy with the, small project?" Frank grunted, sizing me up. "That's me, Leo Maxwell," I said, shaking his calloused hand. "And this must be—" "My nephew, Kyle," Frank sighed, as if the very name was a burden. "He's my apprentice, supposedly." Kyle whipped out his phone. "What's up, guys? Kyle here. Checking out a new potential build. Gonna be epic. Don't forget to smash that like button." Frank just closed his eyes for a moment. I led them to the garage and unrolled the blueprints. Frank stared at them, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He traced a line with a thick finger. "So," he said slowly, "let me get this straight. You want to pay us, with real American dollars, to build a dollhouse in your front yard." "It's not a dollhouse," I corrected him firmly. "It's a residential structure for avian tenants, and it's an act of protest against a tyrannical homeowners association." Kyle's eyes lit up. He started filming me. "Whoa, hold up. You're beefing with your HOA? Dude, that's content. That's primetime drama." He pointed his phone at the blueprints. "So you're building a tiny version of your house just to tick them off?" "It's called malicious compliance," I said proudly. Kyle lowered his phone, a look of genuine reverence on his face. "Dude, legend." He turned to his uncle. "Frank, we have to take this job. This is gonna be sick." Or hashtag bird mansion, petty goals. The algorithm is gonna eat this up. Frank rubbed his temples, letting out a long, suffering sigh that seemed to carry the weight of generations of putting up with idiots. "The kid's right about one thing," he finally said, looking at me. "It's the weirdest damn thing I've ever heard of, which means the pay better be good." He named a price. It was fair. "Fine," he grumbled. "We'll do it. But we're getting paid weekly, in cash. I don't want a paper trail for this nonsense." The project began the following Monday. The first step was the foundation. Frank and Kyle arrived with a small cement mixer and began framing out a perfect 4-by-2.5-foot rectangle on my front lawn, right where the tiki condo used to be. The sight of a construction crew pouring a miniature concrete slab was, I'll admit, beautifully absurd. It also immediately drew the attention of my next-door neighbor, Gary. Gary was the neighborhood's unofficial surveillance system and town crier, a friendly gossip who communicated almost exclusively by leaning over the fence that separated our properties. "Morning, Leo," he called out, his head popping up over the hedges. "Putting in a new mailbox?" "Something like that, Gary," I said with a grin. "Just a little landscaping feature." "Looks awfully permanent for a landscaping feature," he noted, eyeing the wet concrete. "Brenda's not gonna like that. She was on patrol earlier, did 2 slow drive-bys. I clocked her at 7:48 and 9:15 a.m. "I'm counting on her not liking it, Gary," I said. Frank and Kyle finished the slab, smoothing it to a perfect finish. As they packed up their tools, I saw it. Brenda's beige sedan, cruising slowly down the street. It paused in front of my house just long enough for me to see the silhouette of her head, unmoving, before it continued on its joyless way. The first shot had been fired. The concrete was poured. There was no turning back now. The framing went up the next day. As Frank and Kyle hammered together the tiny 2x4s, the structure began to take shape, and the true, unholy nature of my plan became visible to the entire neighborhood. It wasn't just a box. It was, undeniably, a perfect skeleton of my own house, shrunk down to the size of a golden retriever. The effect was uncanny, hilarious, and deeply, deeply unsettling for the established order of Maple Creek Estates. Brenda did not waste time. The morning after the frame was complete, a new beige envelope was taped to my front door. It wasn't even in the mailbox. This was a personal delivery. I tore it open. It was a formal notice of violation, complete with a grainy, zoomed-in photo of the miniature frame. The new charge? Unapproved construction without a registered building permit. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud. I marched right over to the HOA office, which was just a sad, little-used room in the community clubhouse, and found Brenda holding court with her clipboard. "A building permit?" I said, slapping the letter down on her desk. "Brenda, it's a lawn ornament. It's 4 feet tall. Are you going to require a permit for Gary's garden gnome next?" "A garden gnome does not have a poured concrete foundation, Leo," she said without looking up from her papers. "That is a permanent structure, and you did not get approval from the Architectural Review Committee." "The committee you're the head of?" "The very same." "It's a birdhouse." "It's a violation," she countered, finally looking at me with cold, dead eyes. "Pay the fine." That was just the beginning of the paper-based onslaught. A new fine appeared on my door every other day for increasingly creative and desperate infractions. When Frank started putting up the plywood sheathing, I got a ticket for use of non-standard timber dimensions. When they were hammering, I received a violation for excessive noise pollution during migratory bird quiet hours, a regulation I'm almost certain she invented on the spot. When a small pile of sawdust accumulated on the lawn, I was fined for unattractive accumulation of construction debris. Each letter was more passive-aggressive than the last. I started a collage of them on my fridge. Brenda, realizing her beige envelopes of doom weren't stopping the project, decided to escalate. I was out front one afternoon discussing window placement with Frank when a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. 2 officers, a younger man and an older, more seasoned-looking cop, got out. My heart did a little jump. Okay, I hadn't expected this. The older one, whose name tag read Miller, approached me. "Good afternoon, sir. Are you the homeowner?" "I am," I said. "Is there a problem, officer?" "We received a call about an unpermitted secondary dwelling unit being constructed on this property," he said, consulting his notepad with a sigh that suggested this was already the dumbest call of his week. I gestured grandly to the tiny house. "You mean this?" "Officer, it's a birdhouse. See?" I pointed to the small square we'd cut out for the future front door. "Tiny entrance, for birds." Officer Miller stared at it. His partner, Davis, walked around the structure, trying very hard to maintain a professional demeanor. I could see his shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter. "Sir," Miller said slowly, "the report mentioned a poured concrete foundation and a wooden frame for a dwelling. It's a high-wind area," I said with a straight face. "I wanted to make sure it was secure, for the birds' safety. Can't have their house blowing away in a storm. Think of the little hatchlings." Davis finally cracked. He let out a snort of laughter, which he tried to cover with a cough. "So the person or persons, residing in this dwelling would be… what? A family of wrens? Hopefully blue jays, I replied earnestly. I'm putting in a really nice tiny bathroom for them. I found a guy on Etsy who makes 1/12 scale Italian marble tile. It's going to be gorgeous. That was too much for them. Miller finally broke into a grin. He turned away from me and spoke into his shoulder radio, his voice heavy with resignation. Dispatch, this is Car 12. We've made contact at the location. The situation is under control. The unpermitted dwelling is a birdhouse. I repeat, it is a very, very elaborate birdhouse. We're clear. Over. He turned back to me. Sir, your neighbor seems to think you're building a house for people. My neighbor, I said, pointing a thumb toward Brenda's house, needs a hobby that doesn't involve terrorizing people who just want to provide quality housing for the local avian population. Officer Miller tipped his hat. Well, you have a nice day, sir. And, good luck with the Jays. They got back in their car, both of them chuckling as they drove away. The law had officially declared my project a birdhouse. It was a major victory. The incident, however, had an unintended consequence. Kyle had been live-streaming the entire police encounter. It was his masterpiece. The video, which he titled, Karen Hoey President Calls the Cops on a Birdhouse, went nuclear. Within hours, it had thousands of views. By the next day, it was being shared on local news websites. The hashtag #BirdHouseWars was trending in our city. Suddenly, our quiet suburban street was a tourist destination. People started doing slow drive-bys, their kids pointing and laughing from the back seats. A local news van showed up. A young, enthusiastic reporter interviewed me on my lawn, right in front of the half-finished project. Sarah, acting as my impromptu public relations manager, had coached me. Be charming, she'd said. Be the quirky, lovable retiree. Don't be the sarcastic, spiteful maniac I know you are. I did my best. I talked about my passion for engineering, my love for nature, and my simple desire to build something beautiful. I framed myself as the humble victim of a power-mad HOA president who had nothing better to do than measure birdhouses. Brenda, who refused to be interviewed, was portrayed as the villainous Queen of Beige. I was a local folk hero. This, of course, only poured gasoline on the fire of Brenda's fury. The war had been bureaucratic. Now, it got personal. I came out one morning with my coffee to inspect the progress. A strange, damp smell hit me. I walked over to the birdhouse. The exterior was soaked, dark patches staining the new plywood. I peered inside one of the tiny window frames. The miniature drywall sheets Frank had just installed were warped and buckling. The whole interior was a soggy mess. I looked at my lawn. A trail of water led from the birdhouse directly to the property line I shared with Brenda. I looked over at her house. Her sprinkler system was running, but one of the heads, the one closest to my yard, was pointing at an odd angle. Not at her petunias, but directly at my project. There was no concrete proof, but I knew. Gary confirmed it later that day, leaning over the fence with a conspiratorial whisper. Saw Brenda out late last night, Leo. Real late. Around 2 a.m. Said she was inspecting her petunias for nocturnal pests. Seemed mighty interested in your sprinkler heads, though. A cold rage, far more intense than simple annoyance, settled in my chest. She had crossed a line. She had damaged my property. She had declared all-out war. Fine. I was a retired engineer with a lot of time on my hands. She had no idea who she was messing with. The next escalation didn't come in a beige envelope. It arrived via a certified mail carrier who looked at me with an expression of profound pity. The envelope was thick, heavy, and bore the letterhead of a downtown law firm. Dewey, Cheatham and Howe. I'm not even joking. I signed for it, a knot tightening in my stomach. This felt different. This felt serious. I sat down at the kitchen table and sliced it open. The letter inside was dense with threatening legal jargon. Words like cease and desist, covenant violations, nuisance abatement, and potential litigation jumped out at me. They were threatening to sue me, not just fine me, but drag me into court, seeking damages and a court order to have the structure forcibly removed at my expense. They gave me 7 days to comply. Okay, this isn't funny anymore, Sarah said, reading the letter over my shoulder. Her voice was tight with genuine worry. Leo, they can't actually sue us over a birdhouse, can they? They can sue anyone for anything, Sarah, I said grimly. Winning is another story, but they can make our lives a living hell in the process. Legal fees, depositions, it's a nightmare. For the first time, I felt a flicker of doubt. Was this worth it? Was a stupid, spiteful joke worth draining our retirement savings to fight a lawsuit? I looked out the window at the tiny house. The siding was halfway on, a perfect miniature replica of our own. The little window frames were installed. It was absurd, yes, but it was also mine. It was my stand against the soul-crushing beige conformity that Brenda represented. Tearing it down now would be more than a defeat. It would be a surrender of the spirit. No, I said, my resolve hardening. No, I'm not backing down. She's a bully, and the only thing a bully understands is when you punch back. I looked at Sarah. Or in this case, when you find a loophole in her own ridiculously oversized rulebook. That night, fueled by a potent combination of coffee, rage, and righteous indignation, I embarked on the most boring quest of my life. I was going to read the entire Maple Creek Estates HOA covenant and bylaws. All 300 pages of it. The document was a masterpiece of legal obfuscation, so dense and repetitive it felt like it had been designed as a sleep aid. I read about fence height regulations, acceptable shrubbery varieties, and the proper procedure for storing trash receptacles. By 2 a.m., my eyes were burning, and my brain felt like it was full of sand. I was about to give up, to concede that Brenda's beige tyranny was legally airtight. Then, buried deep in a 1998 addendum to the original bylaws, in a section titled Permitted Lawn and Garden Decorations, I saw it. A single, beautiful, forgotten clause. Clause 24B. It was about decorative garden follies. I had to look up the term. A folly, in architectural terms, is a building constructed primarily for decoration, but suggesting through its appearance some other purpose, like a miniature castle or a fake Roman ruin. They were popular on large estates in the 18th century. I read the HOA's definition. A decorative garden folly is defined as a non-habitable structure, intended for aesthetic purposes, which may mimic the appearance of a functional building. Such follies are permitted as Class C lawn decorations. My heart started pounding. I scanned the rest of the section, my finger tracing the lines. There were regulations for gnomes, Class A, fountains, Class B, and even decorative wagon wheels, Class D. But for Class C, for the beautiful, wonderful, decorative garden follies, there was a critical omission. There were rules about materials. There were rules about placement. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing about size restrictions. It was a hole in the legal armor big enough to drive a truck through. Or, in my case, to build a very large birdhouse in. Brenda, in her haste to control, Every other aspect of our lives had overlooked the archaic loophole for fake castles. A slow, triumphant grin spread across my face. I had her. Brenda, emboldened by her lawyers, called an emergency HOA meeting. The official purpose was to vote on a special assessment for the forcible removal of a non-compliant structure at 124 Oak Street. She was coming for my birdhouse with the full force of the community. The community center meeting room was packed. It felt less like an HOA meeting and more like a title fight. Half the neighborhood was there, buzzing with gossip. The local news reporter had returned with a cameraman. And in the back, of course, was Kyle, phone held high, live streaming the whole thing to his legion of hatted Birdhouse Wars followers. Brenda stood at a podium next to a projector screen. She began her presentation. It was a long, mind-numbingly dull PowerPoint about the importance of rules, the sanctity of conformity, and the threat of declining property values. She showed slide after slide of perfectly manicured, identical-looking lawns, followed by a grainy, ominous-looking photo of my project, which she referred to as the structure. She spoke of dangerous precedents and the erosion of community standards. The crowd was getting restless. Someone in the back loudly yawned. Finally, her moment of triumph arrived. And so, she concluded, her voice ringing with self-importance, I move that the association approve the special assessment to have this monstrosity removed and to pursue all legal remedies against the homeowner. She sat down, looking smug. It was my turn. I didn't use the podium. I walked to the front of the room. Frank, bless his skeptical heart, followed me, carrying a small object covered by a sheet. We placed it on the table. Good evening, everyone, I began. My name is Leo Maxwell, and I'm the homeowner with the monstrosity. A few people chuckled. Brenda has shown you a lot of scary photos and talked about property values. I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about retirement. I told them about my 40-year career, about the sudden, deafening silence of having nothing to do. I talked about how that first, silly tiki condo was the first thing that made me feel useful in months. I got a few sympathetic nods. This project, I said, gesturing towards the general direction of my house, has been the most fun I've had in years. And something funny has happened. More neighbors have stopped by to talk to me in the last 2 weeks than in the last 2 years. Kids stop their bikes to look at it. I think it makes people happy. Because it's weird. It's different. In a neighborhood that sometimes feels a little too, well, beige. More chuckles. The tide was turning. Now, Brenda and her lawyers say I'm breaking the rules. They say my birdhouse is an unpermitted structure. I paused for dramatic effect. And they would be right, if it were a birdhouse. I turned to Frank, who whipped the sheet off the object on the table. It was a perfect, tiny model of the birdhouse, an exact replica of the replica. The crowd murmured in appreciation. But it's not a birdhouse, I continued, my voice clear and steady. It's a Class C lawn decoration. I clicked a button on a small remote, and the projector, which Brenda had left on, flickered to life. On the screen, in huge letters, was the text of Bylaw Addendum 24B, the Decorative Garden Folly Clause. I let them read it. I could see the gears turning in people's heads. According to our own bylaws, I explained calmly, a folly is a building made for decoration that looks like something else. My project is a structure that looks like my house. It's the very definition of a folly. Then, for the grand finale, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small 6-inch tall garden gnome with a fishing pole. I walked over to the model and placed the gnome right next to the tiny front door. "As you can see," I announced to the now captivated room, "this isn't a house. It's a very, very elaborate pedestal for my gnome. It is, by your own definition, a decorative folly. Any birds who choose to live in my gnome's decorative folly are simply his welcome guests." The room was dead silent for a beat. Then someone in the back started to laugh. It was a deep, belly laugh. Then another person joined in, then another, and within seconds, the entire room, save for one horrified-looking Brenda, had erupted in laughter and applause. Gary was pounding the table, tears streaming down his face. The news camera was panning across the cheering crowd. The HOA board, seeing the public relations disaster unfolding before them, hastily voted. Brenda's motion was defeated, 6-1. Her one vote was the only one in favor. She just sat there, her face pale, her clipboard lying forgotten on the table. The war was over. I had won. Victory was sweet, and it smelled like freshly cut lumber. With the legal threats gone and the will of the people on my side, the final phase of construction felt like a celebration lap. Frank and Kyle were practically local celebrities now. People would honk and wave as they drove by. Gary started bringing us lemonade every afternoon. The finishing touches were everything. We meticulously cut and installed miniature vinyl siding, making sure every piece lined up perfectly. Frank, who had gotten way too invested in the project, spent an entire day handcrafting tiny shutters for the windows. Kyle, meanwhile, was focused on the premium features. He installed a tiny bird bath made from a polished geode, and in a stroke of genius, wired up a single, solar-powered LED to serve as a working porch light. It would automatically flick on at dusk, casting a warm, welcoming glow from the miniature porch. Kyle's final TikTok was a cinematic event. He used drone shots. He put it in slow motion. He set the whole thing to some epic orchestral music. It was a 2-minute tour of the finished masterpiece, from the perfectly shingled roof down to the tiny, non-functional doorbell he'd glued next to the front door. The video was titled, "They Fought the Birds, and the Birds Won. Birdhouse Wars, Final Reveal." It got millions of views. I was, apparently, now internet famous, which Sarah assured me was less glamorous than it sounded. But none of that mattered as much as the moment that came a few days later. Sarah and I were sitting on our real porch, drinking our morning coffee, when we saw a flash of blue. A male bluebird, brilliant and vibrant, landed on the roof of the tiny house. He hopped around, inspecting the shingles, then dropped down to the porch and peeked inside the door. He chirped a few times, then flew off. "A scout," I whispered to Sarah, as if we were watching a nature documentary. An hour later, he was back, this time with a female. They spent the better part of the morning flying in and out, exploring every nook and cranny of their potential new home. Finally, we saw the female emerge with a single piece of straw in her beak, the first piece of a new nest. They were moving in. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated joy. It wasn't about beating Brenda anymore. It was about this little flicker of life. We had built something ridiculous, born out of spite and boredom, and these beautiful little creatures had decided to call it home. Frank and Kyle stopped by that weekend, ostensibly to pick up their last check. but I knew they really wanted to see the finished product with its new tenants. Frank tried to maintain his gruff exterior, but I saw him smile as he watched a bluebird pop its head out of a second-story window. "You know," he said, handing me a small package, "in 30 years of construction, building everything from shopping malls to custom homes, this is the dumbest, most ridiculous, absolute best thing I've ever built." I opened the package. It was a tiny, custom-made welcome mat that said, "Home Tweet Home." The aftermath in the neighborhood was a quiet, pleasant revolution. Brenda, publicly humiliated and stripped of her power, resigned as HOA president. A few weeks later, a for sale sign appeared on her immaculate lawn. I never saw what outfit her concrete goose was wearing when she left. A younger, much more relaxed woman named Linda took over the HOA, and her first official act was to declare a Most Creative Mailbox competition. The beige reign of terror was over. Maple Creek Estates had learned to lighten up. Life settled into a new, comfortable rhythm. I had found my post-retirement calling. I was no longer just a retired engineer. I was the guy who fought the HOA for a birdhouse and won. I was a creator of absurdly wonderful things. Which brings me to today. Sarah walked into the garage, now my permanent workshop, with that familiar, suspicious look on her face. I was hunched over the workbench, my drafting tools once again spread out before me. "Oh no," she said, her tone a perfect blend of dread and affection. "I recognize that look. You're plotting. What is it this time?" I looked up, unable to suppress the twinkle in my eye. "I was just talking to Gary over the fence," I said casually. "He was saying his beagle, Buster, has been looking a little sad in that old plastic doghouse of his. He thinks the acoustics are poor for howling." Sarah stepped closer, peering at the new set of blueprints I was sketching out. They showed a perfect 2-scale replica of Gary's own ranch-style house. My design included a small, covered porch for afternoon naps, and right next to it, a miniature, non-functional fire hydrant. She sighed, but it was the happy, resigned sigh of a woman who knew exactly what she'd signed up for. "You are going to be the death of me, Leo Maxwell." "Maybe," I said, picking up my pencil. "But think of the harmony, Sarah. The architectural harmony." She rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. As she walked out, I got back to work. A man with a purpose, a plan, and a whole neighborhood of potential new projects. The birds were happy. Soon the dogs would be too.